for that, and I hope a lot of the realities and the truths about what's happened to Osime will be made properly public. But what I did want to say to you all is that even though we're only just getting to build up a picture, it's very difficult speaking with masks, isn't it? But very good, you're all wearing them. There are lots of pieces of the jigsaw that are missing, but I think what we feel as Osime's lawyers is that this case is in many ways a paradigm of the racism and the systemic discrimination that lies at the heart of the criminal justice system in this country. What do I mean by paradigm? Well, it's one of those words that comes into your head, and I looked it up. And it is the right word. Dictionary definition: an outstandingly clear or typical example or archetype. So why do I say this? Well, first, because of the catalogue of failings that it seems to us on the information already out there in the public domain, and we can't talk about stuff that isn't in the public domain, but from the information we have from the public domain, it seems that there is a catalogue of failings typical of the systemic discrimination faced by black people, by people with learning difficulties, learning disabilities, and if you have both of those, then you are in a dangerous place. That's the reality in this society, you're in a dangerous place. So the failing of the schools to identify his disability and to get him the help and support he needed through the education system. We all know of the problem of black children, black boys in particular, being seen as acting up, being seen as discipline problems, and what is actually a response to the difficulties they have dealing with a learning disability, that actually it's characterised as misbehaviour, as misconduct, and they find themselves on a fast track out of education into being criminalised. We see the failings of social services, who, far from being a support to enable someone like Osime to fulfil his potential, to have access to things that we all take for granted, those things were denied him. He was taken from his family home on the grounds that this was good for him, that it's what he wanted, but actually what happened was he was removed the main support he'd had throughout a childhood in which he hadn't been given the support he needed. The main support he had was his family, and it was decided he would be better off without the support of his family. So that's the next stage in the terrible story. Then we see the role of joint enterprise. This principle, this legal principle that you can be held responsible for the criminal acts of another person if you're in a group. So it's very, very typically used disproportionately against black people. The gang narrative gets wheeled out. We don't yet know the full picture about his criminal case. We don't know. There is a lawyer, as we understand it, looking into the possibility of a challenge to that conviction. But Osime is serving a 5-year prison sentence based on primarily on joint enterprise. And just by way of bolstering the concerns we have there, the Prison Reform Trust did a study of sample cases, doing a paper on joint enterprise, and found that, quote, of the defendants for whom ethnicity was known, around 2/3 were from minority ethnic groups, and over 40% were black. And that we'll be aware of the campaign Jenga, who describes joint enterprise as a racist concept. So it's used to discriminate, and its impact on black people in this country is racist. Also, disproportionately, it does seem that people with learning disabilities feature in joint enterprise cases. You might think that not surprising given that in a group, often people may be more suggestible and go along with a group, not knowing actually what's going on. Suddenly they find themselves in the dock for murder. Not Osime is not serving for the sentence for murder. Can everyone hear me okay? So that's the history of how he got to prison. Once he gets to prison, how he's treated is also a classic example. Now, we don't have much information on his treatment in prison. We're trying to get his prison records, but there is an apparent failure to address his particular needs as required by law, as a matter of law, as a matter of human rights law, as a matter of equality law, and as a matter of the prison service's own policies and procedures. There should be an assessment when someone arrives of their particular needs to make sure that they are that the prison regime, the punitive, in reality, prison regime, is not disproportionately punitive against people because of their disabilities. And yet we know disproportionately people with disabilities end up in the SEG, in the segregation unit, facing disciplinary charges, not getting out because of misconduct. Their behaviour that's a consequence of their disability being characterised as disobedience, as breaking the rules. The rules don't fit them and they're not adapted for them. The apparent failure, again, we need to know more about this to adequately manage his risk of self-harm, which can cause both serious injury and obviously possibly death. That is a very, very deep concern for Osime's family for obvious reasons. We need to know more about this. We are trying to find out more. He also has a heart condition, so there's an extra physical vulnerability. And the apparent difficulties that he has had accessing proper legal advice. That is a story that's continuing. I won't go into details, but it is a deep concern to us that any prisoner should not have proper access to their right to legal advice, but particularly someone kind of facing the level of risk that Osime faces. Third, the fact that post-prison, he faces the threat of deportation. He's done, he'll do his time, hopefully for a crime it turns out he did not commit, and hopefully will be quashed. But even if he committed the crime, he's done his time, and yet he faces double punishment of deportation. That is under challenge as well. The case has been remitted back for a fresh decision. That is another fight that Osime faces, for which he needs all your support. Of course, what's happened to Osime chimes with what we know about the deep-rooted problem of racism and discrimination in the criminal justice system. We know that black and minority ethnic people make up 27% of the prison population. They're about, 13%, I think, of the population in this country, yet double that percentage in prison. 50%, fully 50% of children, yes, there are children in detention, disgusting. Children and young people in child prisons and young offender institutions are black and minority ethnic. We also know that black men are 26% more likely than white men to be remanded in custody. And in relation to the treatment of people with a learning disability in prison, the Prison Reform Trust recently found that 20 to 30% of offenders have learning difficulties or learning disabilities that interfere with their ability to cope with the criminal justice system. And there's report after report on this. This place back here will be full of papers gathering dust on how things have to change. With the grisly photos of various Home Secretaries, Labour and Tory. It's going to change. It's never going to happen again. And yet here we are. It's worth remembering, isn't it, that lefty radical Winston Churchill, obviously meant ironically, said that a society is judged by how it treats its prisoners, that it tests the moral, I'm trying to remember the phrase, I wrote it down somewhere, the moral fibre of a nation can be judged by how it treats its prisoners. And Osime's case shows us how this society treats its prisoners. So that's why I say that this case is a paradigm for the racism and discrimination at the heart of the criminal justice system. We're continuing our work with Osime and his parents to secure justice for him in the face of the outrages that we fear are being perpetrated, have been and still are being perpetrated. And we do so remembering the good old words of the Old Testament. Remember those in prison as if you were their fellow prisoners. And that those who are mistreated, remember them as if you yourselves were suffering. You know, these ancient principles. We're meant to be a modern democracy. Our government goes around the world telling other people, normally because they want something from it, like it's oil or it's other geopolitical significance, going on about their human rights records. Well, you know, put your own house in order. You lot. But actually, of course, I don't have to tell this to any of you, because you're here because you know that the law can't be trusted, that the law has to be kicked and pushed into doing the right thing, and that it takes action outside of the courtroom. So I just want to thank you all. I want to pay tribute, especially to Joan, Osime's mum, who is an absolute rock. And also to pay tribute to the mothers, because it is so often, as a lawyer doing this kind of work, so often it is the mothers who fight for their loved ones, who died in police stations, who died in prison cells. It's the mothers who are the rock, and they fight for all of us. We all need those rights. Doesn't matter how privileged we are. Well, that's not really true, is it? Sort of true. Who knows when we'll end up in a situation where we need those rights, and then we'll wish that we've been there on the streets fighting. So you are fighting for everybody. Having quoted the Bible and Churchill, I thought I'd finish with Harriet Tubman. If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. Thank you all.